In this video, we'll take another look at the fossil data that hopefully you have seen in the prior discussions about evolution, and in particular in the proof for evolution video. The question we'll be asking in this second look at the fossil data is, do the fossils appear when Genesis history says they should appear? If you remember, the sequence of creative acts that are reported in the first chapter of Genesis states that basically sea plants, plants were formed first, and later on aquatic animals, and then birds, and then mammals, and then humans. And so there is a definite sequence predicted, and hopefully you have looked at the cosmic clock video, which has given length in Earth years to each of the 6 days of biblical creation. So in other words, day one, if you remember, was about 8 billion years long, day two about 4 billion years long, etc. And so if we utilize the cosmic clock information and look at the fossil data to see when it appeared relative to the cosmic clock's timing for creative events, we can see whether or not the fossil data are explained or in agreement or not agreement with that thing. So let's look at that. Now, in a brief summary here, if you remember, the fossils are nothing but dead plants and animals that have been encased inside of rock, and paleontologists look for these fossils and unearth them in effect, and they date these fossils based upon geologic times in general. They find a fossil of, let's say, a crustacean in a rock, and they look at the geologic age of that rock in general, and they determine, well, that crustacean was deposited at about this particular time in geologic history. So that's what paleontologists do. And as you are aware, in general, they have found that simpler plants and animals are found in the oldest rocks. More complex animals and plants are found in the youngest rocks. And so we're asking the question, with Genesis to creation days and equivalent Earth years, did the plant and animal fossils appear in the Genesis history when it is stated that they should appear? Let's take a look at that. Now, this is a plot of the fossil data. Remember, over 1,000 points of fossil data from several books that contain a wide variety, a representative variety of the fossils that have been found. And if you remember, we're interested in these columns of fossil data, and the example that I've always used is that of the algae. And so we're looking here at a time span here from the present to the past. So here is where we are right now at 0, and here is 3.5, 4 billion years ago when the Earth was formed. And each one of these columns of data are for a particular type of animal, and I've used the example of the algae here as representative of all the rest of the columns. You'll see in this plot here that the oldest algae that has been discovered is about 500 million years ago. There were algae that were younger than that were discovered, but the oldest one is 500 million years, and therefore that is the first algae that appeared in the fossil record. And the same for the rest of these columns over here. The top number, the top oldest fossil of that type is what we currently know as the oldest version of that type. So let's look at this data again from the perspective of equivalent Earth years for these creation days. And here we have, over here on the right hand side, we have day 3, which went from this range to that range. And in the Bible, it says that the earth was created and that vegetation was created. It does not mention that any animals created, just vegetation. And then we look at the fossil record, and these 9 areas, you may remember, from various parts of the world, there were 9 discoveries in these old, very old ancient rocks of fossils, and it is pretty well decided right now that all 9 of those fossil records are plants. They're actually plant seeds. and there are no animals there, even though paleontologists and other evolutionary advocates have been attempting to analyze these in ways that could lead to some of them being animals. Of course, some of them are needed to be animals in evolution theory because you cannot have animals just instantaneously appear as they appear to have done here. You have to have some precursors, and they have not been found to date. So day 3, where vegetation is created, is exactly consistent with what the fossil find has been to date. In day 4, the only thing that happened on day 4 relative to um, growing of living beings has been stated that vegetation continues to grow. So on that day, vegetation is growing, and as you see, again, with these 9 data points here, these 9 areas of fossil finds, that only thing that's happening is vegetation is growing. And so what this basically says is that Genesis history explains why evolutionists have not found any Precambrian animal fossils. It is consistent with the idea that only plants should be found on day 3 and day 4s of biblical creation, and that indeed is what has happened. And it predicts, or implies more exactly, that there should be no animal fossils found in these Precambrian times. Now let's look a little more detailed. This is the same sort of a fossil plot with all but those 9 plant fossils shown in more detail. And again, the highest column reflects the interesting point, the oldest of these various types of plants and animals that have been found. And here is, again, if you saw the Proof for Evolution video, you'll see that these, again, were the Cambrian explosion plants and animals that appeared on the scene over a relatively short period that have been troubling to evolutionists because there should be perhaps a more slow progression from one plant to another, and from one plant or animal to another animal. And so this is a troubling area, but again, let's look at what is predicted, in this case, on day 5 for biblical creation. On day 5, water creatures were formed and fish were formed. And we see that these Cambrian explosion plants and animals were basically all water creatures, from algae to mollusks. Crustaceans, sponges, corals are in this range, and those qualify as water creatures. And they were created during day 5 as predicted, as stated in biblical creation. Another aquatic being that was created was fish. And we can see that the oldest fish are well within day 5 as having been created during that time. I'll skip sea monsters for a few minutes here and just go on and say that birds who are created on day 5 also appeared right at the end of day 5. The oldest fossil of a bird is right there. And so everything is in agreement on day 5, with the exception of sea monsters that I'll put off until you look at the next slide. We have not yet found an old enough sea monster to agree with this, but that's the only failing of this historical representation of the onset of various life forms in biblical creation. We look back now again also at day 6, which is in this range here, that cattle and land animals, which is basically mammals, were to have been created, and indeed they were created right at the beginning of day 6 and ends up in the creation of man, which is also within that day. So everything at this point has appeared as land animals, mammals. Man appeared on day 6 as stated in Genesis history, and it correctly predicts the timing of the living beings on earth. If you look at this slide in more detail and look at the prior slide, you'll see that basically everything is in agreement with when these various fossils should have appeared, and it's predicted, believe it or not, by the historical account in the first chapter of Genesis, when those 6 days of creation are given or are represented in the time span that we have determined, that Professor Gerald Schrader has determined from the cosmic clock. Now here's a brief look at a candidate for that sea monster It is known as the mosasaur. It's a dinosaur, an aquatic dinosaur, basically a giant sea snake, if you want to think of it that way. The oldest one is about 55 feet long and 20 tons. And to date, the oldest mosasaur that has been found is about 85 million years ago. Now, there are other aquatic dinosaurs that are older than that, and they potentially could be the representative of this first sea monster that is predicted in Genesis. But to date, we don't have that. We need a mosasaur or some other aquatic fossil that is older than about 225 million years ago. That is the beginning of that, or the end of day 5, during which the Genesis predicts that a sea monster was created. So that remains as something to be looked for, and if anyone has any ideas as to which creature might be the first sea monster, let me know. Now, in summary, what you have seen is that the fossil data strongly back the creation history reported in Genesis. Species appear when reported on cosmic clock timing, the only exception right now being a sea monster. And to me, that's relatively amazing that this ancient book could have got this information not only right in order, but sequentially and with the timing that we now know as the cosmic clock, that all of that should be in agreement, and that's really amazing. Now, Genesis history removes the difficulty that evolutionists are having with the absence of these Precambrian animal fossils. There should be no Precambrian animal fossils found according to the timing in Genesis. Only plants were formed during days 3 and 4, which cover this Precambrian time, and so therefore there's no conflict in Genesis history. Similarly, the evolutionists' trouble with this so-called Cambrian explosion, where all manner of plants and animals appeared at about 500 million years ago, does not provide a complication for a biblical creation, because it just says that in day 5 these plants and animals should have appeared, and they did. They appeared rather rapidly, but there is no particular timing of the individual species named in Genesis, so there's not a conflict with biblical creation. So overall, you have seen that Genesis history, as reported in chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, that it best explains the fossil record. There are no gross deviations. The only exception right now is to finding this older sea monster, which probably is not much of a problem. Thank you for looking at this video, and hope you will continue forward.